A Republican, I don't call myself a conservative. I believe in freedom and limited government. What would you call me? Let's talk about it when freedom returns at 5.
Good morning, Dan and Kristen McCreary of the Chicago Tribune editorial board in for Amy. And this is a fun story. Trump wants more tax breaks on the old Trump Tower downtown. He's enlisted the help of Alderman Ed Burke, one of the Democrat Panjan drum / property tax appeals attorneys that we feature here in Chicago and Illinois.
Yes.
How about it?
I think he got an $11 million tax break with Burke's help the last time he appealed over a series of years. Does that sound about right? $11 million.
Yeah, it's not. It's
so that's $11 million not going to our schools and libraries and government, etc.
Yeah, looks like the refunds could total more than $3 million this time. Hey, so it's nice to see. This is how we do it here. Democrats and Republicans working together to fleece everybody else.
Right.
That's how we do it in Chicago, so it's nice to see that's continuing. Take a little note there. Also, speaking of House Republicans, speaking of Republicans and returning to the House is probably more accurate, Paul Ryan over the weekend with Chris Wallace talking about the tax plan and very sanguine on it. There's an agreement to a framework with the Senate, and that's why this time it's not going to suffer the same fate as Obamacare replace.
So what we did this time differently was we worked with the Senate ahead of time from the summer on to put this bill together to basically create a framework of this bill, House, Senate, and the White House, and launch this thing together and be very coordinated. So we basically decided the big ticket items, a 20% corporate rate, a 25% rate for pass-through businesses, the middle-class tax cut, all of those things are things we agree on. And so these bills are written within those details. So that's why those differences will be fairly narrow.
Who's this week? Imosabi, Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, not happy with the rate set for pass-through businesses, which would be 25%. I mean, down from 39.6 necessarily, admittedly. But one issue that I know has to be fixed is the whole issue with pass-through, said Ron Johnson, who called the House language on small business taxation completely unacceptable. If you're losing Ron Johnson, you're not in a particularly strong position, although one other thing that Paul Ryan did say was on the table in terms of additions to that framework that he says they have agreement on, which senators like Ron Johnson don't seem to agree with, is the possibility of a repeal of the individual mandate.
Yeah, we have an active conversation with our members on a whole host of ideas on things to add to this bill, and that's one of the things that's being discussed.
You say it's being discussed. So there is a possibility the House could pass as part of tax reform, doing away with the individual mandate.
We're listening to our members about what we can do to add to this bill to make it even better. So that's among the ideas that a lot of members are suggesting that we could add to this bill to make it even better.
Mm-hmm. And responding to the charge from the usual suspects, Senate Minority Leader Pagliacci and Pelosi and the whole gang, that this is hits the middle class. It's not relief for the middle class. Paul Ryan had this to say.
Yeah, so here's what we're doing. So you see this postcard? This is literally the kind of tax form that 9 out of 10 taxpayers would be able to use. Right now, about 70% don't itemize. By doubling the standard deduction, we're making it so that people don't have to itemize their deductions. So instead of having the first $12,000 that you don't pay tax on, it'll be the first $24,000 for a couple you don't pay your tax on, and we're lowering people's tax rates. The difference here is we're basically saying instead of using a tax deduction to lower your tax rate, lower your tax liability, we're just going to make it easier for you to don't pay taxes in the first place. But this is a clear middle-class tax cut, no two ways about it, even for people in those high-tax states.
Are there two ways about it? For an answer to that question, we'll enlist our friend Jim Pethokoukis, CNBC contributor and columnist for the American Enterprise Institute. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, what's happening?
So is Paul Ryan right that no two ways about it, this plan provides middle-income families with tax relief?
Well, I mean, some will. Some people who are going to describe themselves as middle class are probably going to have a tax increase. But listen, we can try to parse this bill, but the reality is that this bill, as it is, not going anywhere because they can't pay for it. Ryan can say, like, we've agreed on these big-ticket items. Well, that doesn't say anything. It's like saying we agree on tax cuts. Yeah, got it. We agree on tax cuts. But they can't pay for it. And to pay for it, they're going to have to make substantial changes in this bill. And I'm sure that it may pass the House, something like this, but it's going to have to undergo deep revisions in the Senate. So to say that we sort of agree on it isn't really saying anything.
Well, one of the things that came out over the weekend after they announced this plan on Thursday was watering it down on Friday. A revised version of the bill would impose the chain CPI adjustment for tax brackets immediately instead of phasing that in 2023. And that just, frankly, means more income would be taxed at higher rates over time. The change CPI provides less indexing than does the CPIW or the standard CPI without getting too technical, right?
Well, here's the thing, is that even if you assume this bill provides growth, it still is going to lose maybe $1 trillion over 10 years. All right, so either can say, we don't care about that. Some people might say that. The budget rules say you have to care about that. So they need so between the change CPI, that is just a drop in the bucket of what they're going to need to help pay for this bill, which means that the centerpiece, even though we've been talking sort of about the middle class, that the supposed growthy centerpiece is the dropping the corporate rate to 20%. Well, they're not going to be able to they either won't be able to do that. They're going to have to phase it in. They're going to have to make it temporary. This bill is going to have to be substantially different in some key areas before it passes. And I still think it's like a 50-50 proposition at best.
So I guess my question is not having the money, or they don't have the spending is overly optimistic. I don't see that has really impacted lawmakers in Washington or in our state in Illinois ever. They always approve things that they can't afford. So is it worse? What's the political calculus here? Is it worse to vote down this tax bill in the Senate because of those fiscal concerns? Or will they swallow and do it anyway because that's what Washington does?
Well, under the budget rules that they have set up, they have to make a decision. They have to make a decision about, or either don't pass it or substantially change it, because it cannot make deficits worse after 10 years. And now they will. So their two choices are actually vote it down and let's move on to infrastructure, or have another infrastructure week, or B, they need to change this bill, and every change they make adds new complications politically that will provide less economic growth.
Well, what about what if it seems like there's a couple of areas they could go after, to your point about having to comport with the budget rules as so set up. One is carried interest for the hedge fund class. Two is the state and local tax deduction. About 90% of that goes to household incomes over $100,000 anyway. And since basically this plan in its announced form on Thursday was kind of mid to high six-figure earners paying for relief for the hedge fund class as well as the middle class, those seem to me areas where they could make alterations, yes?
Well, the reason this bill is set up the way it is right now is because they could not come to agreement on any of that stuff. They were unable to do it. Listen, I don't know if you guys all remember talk about the border adjustment tax.
Yeah.
When that thing went down, that was the whole Megillah. That's what they were counting on, because they knew everything else was going to be super hard to do. And when that thing went down, that may have actually killed the chances for substantial tax reform.
Well, okay, so then what do you see Paul Ryan doing? I mean, is his position then have a sunny disposition, get this out of the House, and if it fails in the Senate, then I'm absolved of responsibility?
Bingo.
Okay, all right.
That's it.
Don't you think there's...
Trump won't blame them. They can blame the Senate. And who knows, maybe the Senate will come up with something. And the House will vote for whatever the Senate comes up with. No matter what they send, whatever the Senate comes up, they will vote for that. But right now, I think it's just pass the buck.
Don't you think there's tremendous political risk, though, even in the Senate, to once again kick the can. I mean, Trump has talked about keeping them in through Thanksgiving. If they couldn't get Obamacare done, now they're going to, if they can't do tax reform, move on to infrastructure. Isn't that more politically risky than actually passing a half-baked tax cut?
I think there's a lot of political risk in whatever direction they're going here, which is why there's a problem. Listen, I think they need to pass a tax cut, and I sort of can't get my noodle around the idea that you're going to have Republicans dominating government and they don't pass some sort of tax cut. It would really go to an utter lack of governing ability if they do not pass some sort of reasonable tax cut. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of risk.
Well, what about changing the budget rules that are hemming them in? I mean, couldn't they do that as easily as they?
I think it's so late. I don't think they can do that anymore. Well, because when they pass the budget, not to get too in the weeds, they set up what these rules are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
There are also senators who actually still care about deficits who aren't going to want to do that. They're not going to want to say, like, hey, we've been saying we're 5 minutes from a debt crisis, and now we're going to pass a bill that's going to lose $2 trillion. It seems foolish.
Yeah, and to your point, actually, Paul Ryan referenced that in his interview with Chris Wallace, who we're playing excerpts of, talking about having to get around the Senate parliamentarian. So he obviously sees that as a hurdle as well.
Yeah, they absolutely do. They are in a fix here because I think they have overpromised what they can deliver.
Can you tie some threads here together for me? In terms of this tax cut, was this factored into the budget deal that Trump struck with Democrats? And if so, can you talk what ended up being in terms of broad-based spending cuts in the budget? Were there any?
Listen, Republicans have cleared out space for $1.5 trillion in tax cuts. So that is the space. So this plan needs to be shoved in to $1.5 trillion. Right now, it's over $1.5 trillion. So there's that constraint. Constraint number two is that it can't make the deficits worse after 10 years. And right now, this bill certainly does. Mm-hmm. So, and remember, as far as the spending cuts, remember that the president said all the big things, well, we're not touching any of that stuff. So,
right.
They don't really care about the spending cuts. I mean, what are you going to cut? The earned income tax credit?
Well, his initial budget proposal in March did include significant cuts to the Department of Education and Medicaid and other areas of the government. And
great research, health, like science research, all great cuts.
Yes.
That's
well,
added.
This whole thing also speaks to the failure to replace Obamacare with something that is significantly less expensive to create more of the room required.
Partially that would have theoretically on paper created some room, and you see they're still talking about trying to get rid of the mandate, because that will lessen what they have to spend on these subsidies and Medicaid. So at this late date, they are still playing with politically explosive ideas to pay for it. That stuff should be locked down. They should be like dotting I's and crossing T's, not ginning up new things to possibly pay for this.
All right. Thanks for all the good news, Jim. Appreciate
Go get 'em.
it.
Give me a home run, Slugger.
Enjoy yourself out there. Hey, Jim Pethokoukis, CNBC contributor, columnist for the American Enterprise Institute. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he joined us on the turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan